let's get right to it. You all either lead institutions that have the capacity, or in Ajita's case, the potential to reach a lot of people at once and really set a tone for a lot of other institutions that are online. Right now, in light of the economic gaps that have been laid bare over the past few months by the pandemic and, of course, the recent protests for racial justice, I'm wondering from each of you, what have you been thinking about, like right off the bat, that you now realize you have to do right away in the next 6 months, 12 months? What has to change right off the bat? Let's start with Scott, since he's unmuted already, ready to go.
That was the cue. I should have looked for that. Thank you. I think that there are two things that come to mind. First and foremost, that we do have to make sure that we serve our mission and purpose. That is that we are focused on equitable access and attainment. WGU was founded to particularly expand access to high quality education for underserved individuals. I think that gets heightened in this particular situation. We know at WGU that about 70% of our students are from those underserved categories, but access isn't sufficient. We also have to dramatically increase the probability of their success. And so one of the things that we're focused on is increasing our investments into our next generation platform that really allows us to utilize data about everything in a student's journey, from the sequencing of their courses to their engagement with their faculty, to even the programs and the tools and technology and learning resource engagement that we're observing from them, so we can dramatically increase the personalization of that journey. We are an institution that fundamentally believes that if you can personalize the learning journey, you can dramatically increase the probability that every individual can succeed. And so we think that is going to be a great equalizer in terms of the attainment aspect. The last thing I'd mention is that WGU is investing in promoting the expansion, basically, of digital access. If one thing the pandemic has taught us is that the digital divide is also a barrier to access to high quality education. And so that allows us to focus on scholarship programs as well as advanced policy and infrastructure investments that will increase access to broadband or high-speed internet access, because this now becomes a barrier to accessing high-quality education as well. And so those are just some of the things that we're focused on.
And in terms of digital access, I mean, does this mean you're sending out hotspots to people, or is policy focused, or is it like literally on the ground with stuff?
It's both, yeah. So we actually do have programs and scholarship programs that will directly provide either hotspot access or satellite internet, or even just through partnerships and others that we will provide that access. That includes also extending to the digital, computers that they need, or modems and routers, et cetera. And even on the policy front, really advancing the investment in infrastructure that's necessary to reach the roughly 19 million Americans who do not have access to high-speed internet, which we now know increasingly vital to ensuring the livelihood of these individuals and households.
Paul, what about you? In the last what do you think about really new on the agenda for the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, thank you, Goldie. So there's sort of the urgency of the moment. And for that, we've created a $5 million social justice fund from which we can address sort of emergency needs. As a matter of fact, and wholly coincidentally, I was having an exchange with one of George Floyd's family members who's a student, and just sort of expressing sympathies, but also in that conversation about how she was doing, she said her computer was inadequate, and there's a new laptop on its way to her this morning. But that's not unusual. We're sending computers out like Scott hotspots, and we're finding, real inequity in terms of access, which is sort of like access to highways, right? Like, it's just basic if you're not connected. Second thing is, I've asked for a top to bottom review of our justice studies programs, criminal justice programs. We have a lot of people who go into the justice system. Equity can't be a single course. It has to be baked in across that curriculum. And honestly, I didn't need to ask. They were already on top of it and have been working on this, but we've redoubled our efforts. And then, as you know, we're working in a lot of underserved communities through our high school partnerships that are kind of early college models. We do that in Boston and Los Angeles and other places. So we've committed to expanding that network. And then the longer term picture is we're standing up an equity design team to look at the ways we may have inadvertently baked inequities into our systems and processes in ways that aren't even apparent to us today. But I think it happens, and it doesn't happen with ill intent. I just think it happens with lots of reasons. So we're really determined to think about this from a systemic and process perspective as well.
Ajita, these guys are serving students in over 100,000 students at a time. Obviously, Calbright is a lot smaller at this stage. But what kinds of things have you identified, even in the few months that you've been operating, that seem to be need to be sort of have some immediate attention?
Absolutely, I think it pulls a lot from some of the common threads that both Paul and Scott were discussing. When we think about the racial inequity gaps, whether they're triggered by pandemic or by the technological advancements, we have to think about how we don't hardline those inequities and thinking about who is positioned for the economy that reemerges over the next couple of years. So, I think we are prioritizing examining both conventional gaps in higher education and the workforce system and designing new solutions that are primarily positioned to address those gaps. So, we know that in both the conventional and higher ed workforce system, whether it's within states or regions, they're primarily system structures, policies, business practices, and processes that are inequitable by design, and they're very much geared towards serving the incumbent interests of those who currently exist in our colleges, not those who we've kind of squeezed out from those opportunities for advancement, which is an exclusive focus of the work that we do at this college. So we are very focused on really what we're designed to do, which is how do we focus on some of these acute labor market opportunity and need, and really building up our capacity to rapidly deploy more of an R&D function for what both our population needs and really for the change that's needed throughout the community college system. We've put very much an equity lens around where we see serving the needs, particularly of those who are underemployed, those who are unemployed, and in general, the low wage workforce, and figuring out how we connect them from kind of this point in time economic dislocation to connect them to opportunities at our college or within other system colleges.
But how do you do that? Actually, it's a question for all three of you. How do you really assess these labor market needs in a systematic way? Because obviously, it's really hard to get your arms around the whole picture. Go ahead, Ajita, take it, and then we'll run back up the line here.
Yeah, we're thinking a lot about this because I think there's a lot of disparate data sources, and most often than not, what we've relied on, if we've done it at all, has been primarily to look at traditional forecasting of labor market data and things like this. But what we really need is to have more of the capabilities to pull in all different types of data and information resources, contextual resources that are also within, information within regions, coming from industries, coming from employers. So basically to be able to have that kind of infrastructure that is accessible to address both programmatic design things that we need to do, but also that really understand the hiring practices and the demand side of the market. And the main thing I think there is a lot of it is about knitting those things together. It's not about silver bullet solutions or reinventing the wheel, but how smart and savvy we can get, how we can use technology to do those things.
And so, Ajita, you only have to do that in tiny little California, not just a small labor market there. But Paul and Scott, you're looking nationally, in some cases probably even internationally. How do you do this in a systematic way?
I'll jump in. So clearly, as Ajita said, you're looking at data, and we have tools available to us today that we didn't have 10 years ago. So whether it's MC or Burning Glass or any number of the sort of platforms that are scraping data in Phoenix. But I think one of the lessons we've learned is, as we do more work in individual cities, is to really, we have to look locally. So if I use Alabama for an example, if you were to take a look at the labor market needs of Birmingham, they look actually quite different than they do in Mobile. So Mobile is advanced manufacturing and aerospace. In Birmingham, it's healthcare and finance, right? So it depends like how wide you want to open the aperture. But yeah, there's certainly national data, but students don't live nationally, they live locally. And when you're trying to make opportunities available for them, you have to be really thoughtful about slicing and dicing the data. I think it's critical. It's one of the real lessons we've learned over the last 18 months.
So, but at some point, is there some technique for saying we want to analyze this by community as opposed to nationally? I mean,
those same tools that we mentioned often will allow you to drill down to local, certainly regional levels, state levels, but you can often drill down to local levels. And I think you have to triangulate. So you have to really be plugged into the local labor market, which means not the old advisory board model, which I think are kind of tepid and not very effective, but you really have to be talking to local WIBs. And I mean, there are lots of ways you can get at that. People who are thinking about that every day at the local level. And then the problem, Goldie, in some ways, the bigger issue is not how do you get a handle on the current, it's how do you get a handle on the future. I mean, 65% of the job recovery that we had post-2010 were with jobs that didn't exist in 2009. So if you think looking ahead and the recovery that we're going to have to go through in these coming years, maybe the majority of the new jobs don't exist today. And how do we get a handle on that? It's a much more complicated question.
Scott, any thoughts on this? I'm thinking particularly about, you're still offering programs nationally, and it's not like you have a local campus where you have to make a certain program more available to a particular region. So how do you combine this sort of national understanding with local understanding?
Yeah, I was highlighting there into your question is really right, is that there is no really national economy. There are regional economies. There's also no national population. There are, local and regional populations that need to be served. And so I think you can do that even with the master curriculum. I think if I were to add anything, you take all that information that Paul was referencing from the MZ Burning Glass, et cetera, and in your curriculum development, you have to really design such that learning outcomes, in our case, the competencies are directly mapping to the skills and competencies that are being identified in the workforce. And when you do that, you can actually surface real-time insights to students as they're completing courses throughout their program, they're really understanding what opportunities are becoming available to them. And that what is becoming available to me or as a student is relevant locally, because you can combine that specific market-related information with the competencies I'm gaining in my program and start surfacing things that are relevant to me. Who are the employers that are looking for skills and competencies in these areas? Which opportunities and role descriptions or job descriptions are ones that are going to become available to you as you complete these courses? And that becomes really relevant to who you are and also where you are. That is the way I think you connect this. The last thing I would mention is that we at least depend on utilizing advisory councils and employer representation, et cetera, that when we're trying to make that link between the market data and the curriculum design, we're making sure that the competencies and the approaches we're taking to it actually surface proficiency in those competencies that are needed in the workforce.
So it's a little bit more of a, go ahead.
I'd love to add one thing, because I think, we tend to focus on the data as inputs, and we talk about it in the context definitely of instructional design. But the other piece is the who you're designing for. So all of the knowledge that we need to understand about how people get hired is also a critical part to how we design both our learning programs and our student supports. And I think more importantly than anything, it allows us to take more of an asset-based view of individuals who are coming into our institutions to position them better for those employment opportunities, for that continuous, sort of reskilling, re-entry and transition back into the economy. And thinking a lot about those connection points in the design and use of how we use labor market data really makes the difference, particularly for the population that we're talking about, who's not traditionally thought of as talent.
That's interesting. I mean, I think all of you were talking about this it's a little bit of an iterative process, but it's also not a one-way process. It's a sort of a two-way and back and forth. I know all three of you rely a lot on intermediary organizations. I don't know a better way to describe that, feeder organizations and the like to sort of help you achieve scale or build scale in Ajita's case. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the intermediaries and what that even means in this context? Paul, I'm pretty familiar with what you guys have been doing. You mentioned the high schools in Boston and some other places. Because I think that people think about scale as tech, and I don't necessarily think it's tech in your case.
Yeah, that's right.
Only tech, anyway.
So in terms of partnering, they take a variety of forms, but one of the ones that's been most effective for us in terms of scaling is to, particularly if you're talking about, I'm going to go to your starting point, Goldie, around equity. If we're talking about underserved populations, they live in complex context, and frequently we need an on-the-ground and local partner who understands that community, who's often a trusted agent in that community, right? We come in as an outsider. Who are you? And I'm reminded all the time that vulnerable populations are often preyed upon. So trust is important, and they often don't have the social capital to get it wrong. Like a bet on us is a big bet. So having a local partner, so that could be a duet, for example, in Boston, that we provide the program, in this case, our CBE program, and all of the assessments and all of the academics with financial aid processing, et cetera. But they provide all the wraparound supports, including a place to be, right? That crowded apartment where it's too noisy and a bad bandwidth, now it can go to Duet Center downtown Boston and get access to good connectivity, a computer, and all of the advising and tutoring I need. So that takes many forms. It's what we've used with our refugee programs in 5 countries, always a local trusted agent on the ground. So it's a very effective scaling strategy. But there are others like our partnership with Guild, our partnerships directly with employees like Anthem, where you also, and this is from a business perspective, you not only have trust, but you also drive down the cost of acquisition, which allows us to keep our costs lower. Like, I know that sounds very sort of in the weeds, but these things make a difference if you're trying to remain affordable.
Well, can I add on this particular point, Goldie, is that one thing that I think we just have to realize in the age of the internet, proximity no longer requires a campus. I think much of the community college expansion really was about how do you bring a university as close as possible to as many residents in your state, when in reality, the internet has no geographic boundaries in that regard. And so you can dramatically democratize access in a way that you can never do so at a much lower cost in terms of the digital infrastructure that you need to invest in. And I think one thing that WGU, we had a little bit of an interchange on this because Paul in Southern New Hampshire got quite a bit of press around his partnership with the Pennsylvania state system. I think this is a great example of how the governors, when they founded WGU, it was actually by states for states. That even in pursuing a national approach to expanding access, it really was on a state-by-state basis that we do that. And so an institution like us had to be committed to making the investments necessary. That's why we have our state affiliate model. That's why we've invested in, we have 11 statewide articulation agreements with community colleges. And I can't remember the exact percent, but I think it's about 1/3 of our students are actually being referred in from the over 400 community college articulation agreements that we have in. Gina knows this, in California, we have one of those statewide articulation agreements. Those are really important. Plus employer partnerships are really important. The reality is that this is still about awareness. What are the pathways and alternatives that individuals have, and how do you make those increasingly accessible? And all the outcomes that Paul mentioned too are right. It definitely lowers the cost of acquisition. It makes it easier to serve a broader range of individuals, et cetera. So these intermediaries do matter.
Yeah, Adita, same. I know we discussed one last week that you just recently made an arrangement with Opportunity at Work. How are you thinking about using intermediaries to scale Calbright?
Very much the same way. I think the benefit of having this investment in the public sector and as a part of a larger system can't be underestimated. So we are already looking at ways and have a couple partnerships with on the ground community colleges within the system that help us get and facilitate that connection to place-based either services or place-based continuing opportunities for education. Those remain vitally important. We also are thinking about how, again, if we're thinking about the gaps between where we start and end and where the hiring process starts and ends, intermediaries like Opportunity at Work really allow us to help create the local conditions under which all of that is made easier for the multiple parties in that community that have to engage in order to help drive a successful outcome for someone.
So states, local organizations, state affiliates, social service agencies, there's a range of these opportunities out there. I know our time is running down here, but I would kick myself if I didn't ask you guys this question as well. Because obviously bigger isn't necessarily always better, and scaling is important, but quality is also important. I'm wondering if you could all just talk a little bit about how you're thinking about assuring quality as you have grown or as you hope to grow. People want to understand a little bit about what goes into these kinds of understandings, and what do you think about when you're thinking about quality? Paul, and you're nodding, so go ahead.
Oh, sure. I just think sometimes people confuse growth and scale. So growth can get ahead of you and really bite you if you're not careful. And honestly, there was a period in our when we were having meteoric growth where I thought, God, we're breaking our systems. Like, what's going on? And we had to learn the hard way how to scale. And now at scale, I think you have to really harness your sort of systems and your processes and data. And data is critical because it gives you real-time optics into how students are doing. It allows you to intervene at the right moment. It allows you to know if things are going off track. So that for me is critical. And then you have to sort of overlay it with sort of qualitative measures, right? So we think about sort of where is the sort of human intervention, if I can use that phrase for a moment, where is it most important, and is it at the right places? So you have it right, both went sort of from a data perspective, things moving in the right direction. So persistence and graduation. You also know you have it right qualitatively if a student feels like they're not a number in a big system. If they feel like they're having a very personalized experience where people are really attentive to them. So even things like measuring your response time to a student inquiry, that's a question of scale. Like, can you get right back to them where they feel like, oh, this place, I matter to this place. So I think you have to really look at that. And look at this, you don't have to reinvent the wheel if you're going down this path, because this stuff is known. We know how to do quality at scale at this point.
Yeah, and add to that. Yeah, I was going to add to that. We live simply by this model of 1 by 1, which is we solve for the individual student and advance outcomes one student at a time. I think Paul's right. When you get to large scale, you have to ensure that every individual feels like the whole of the university was designed exclusively for them. At WGU, that's the approach that we have, is that you really are leveraging all that data and information that allow you to solve for an individual student in a way that you couldn't do when you're really small. The other thing I would add is that scale has real benefits. This is also me coming from an Amazon background before, where it's not like there was limits to the quality that every new customer you add at Amazon, that somehow the shipping was going to degrade and somehow that, you know, things were going to get worse, et cetera. Like, the reality is the opposite. Why? Because small problems in really large, in a really large scale become really important. For example, if 3% of 1,000 student university are having a problem, it's more like a nuisance. But when 3% of 100,000 students are having a problem, you now have a crowd of 3,000 students who are really mad at you. And I just, you know, I always used to joke, like, what if you walked onto that stage with the audience of 3,000 people who are really annoyed about a problem? You're going to work really hard to solve a problem that may seem small, but in fact, with scale is a really big issue. So scale adds tons of benefits to dramatically improving the student experience.
Gina, you're going to get the last word on this, even though you don't have the scale. Maybe you can take some tips on getting scale from these guys later on.
They haven't told you that, but I definitely am a student of both of their models, and you know, consider them both to be very close colleagues, and have followed the journeys of both of their models very closely, and you know, have the benefit of having learned from that. So I'm definitely appreciative to everyone who has kind of pioneered this space before us. Though one thing that I think is an important addition to the conversation is really around the adaptability piece. So building at scale means that you don't build the same widget for everyone at every point in time, that there's a singular model that's the holy grail of online competency-based education, but that you have the capabilities as an organization to continually adapt to what programmatic changes are needed. So kind of that nimbleness, that flexibility, that ability to both bring up and identify new opportunities, and then to close out opportunities that don't work and things that aren't working. And what's hard to do about this in the public sector, I would say even particularly in California, is that there isn't an allowance for that type of vulnerability, which is exactly what is needed to be able to have an honest conversation about, so that we're continuously striving towards getting better, as opposed to covering our weaknesses.
Yeah, it's a difficult climate right now to take a stumble. Yes. Gosh, we could go on all day, but I know there's a really full program today from JFF. Thank you all for being part of this panel. Thank you, JFF, for including me as part of the moderator. And we'll turn it back to somebody at JFF now, I guess.